Richmond, Virginia was one of the largest slave trading centers in the internal slave trade. And Shockoe Bottom is so important to that history because it was the location of Richmond's slave trading district. Along Wall Street, which was essentially the path of 15th Street, were concentrated a series of auction rooms in which people were sold. And near those auction rooms were a series of jails where people were held sometimes for weeks before being sold in those auction rooms.
The Shockoe Valley is really the beginning of Richmond. It's the very first place that settlement happened back in 1737. It's where the market was, so people from all over the city would come there. It's where eventually all the city hotels and all the main economic activity and cultural life too. So you had the Oddfellows Hall, and you had one of the oldest Masonic temples in the United States. It was just a really, really important center for the early city.
Well, aside from being the birthplace of Richmond itself, aside from still having the original street grid that we've had since 1737, it's important for people like me who, even though I grew up on the West Coast, learned that one of my ancestors, no, in fact, two of my ancestors were actually sold out of Richmond. It makes Richmond my city. It makes Richmond the place that I come to in order to connect with the history of my family, but also the history of the United States. It's a place where people who have been marginalized, people whose systemic marginalization has come forward to a point at which we can begin to change things. We can look at this place and see it as a point of progress, but only if we can fully acknowledge what happened here. What happened here was profound, it was complicated, and it needs to be revealed and it needs to be talked about.
When most people hear the term slave trade, they think about the international slave trade, the trade that forcibly enslaved 12 million Africans and brought them to the New World. About 500,000 of those Africans were brought to the United States. The internal slave trade is the trade that emerged after the end of the international slave trade. And in that trade, 2/3 of a million African Americans were forcibly sold and relocated from the Upper South to work in the burgeoning cotton fields of the Lower South, separating mothers and fathers and parents from their children.
Well, one of the main themes of American history in what we call the late antebellum period, basically the period from about 1820 to 1860, right before the Civil War, is that you have this booming of the Cotton South. Well, that would never have happened without people to work those fields. And those people mostly came from the Upper South. And the money that was made was enormous. Probably it was the biggest industry, if you want to call it that, in Richmond and maybe even the United States at that period. That wealth then went out to people who were, for instance, running cotton mills in the North, England, internationally. So it was an incredible economic driver that really affected the whole United States. It was also one of the massive migrations, forced migrations of people in the history of the United States. So Richmond was really an epicenter of this system.
The internal slave trade is important because it happened here, because Richmond's Shockoe Bottom is literally the epicenter of that internal slave trade. In the 30 years building up to the Civil War and to the end of the Civil War, it was out of this place and out of this state that the majority of African Americans who were then dispersed throughout the country can trace some of their origins.
The challenge with the question of economic development in Shockoe Bottom is that that large area was the site of some of the most horrific crimes in human history. That is, the selling of people. That said, so much of the city of Richmond is implicated in the history of the slave trade and in slavery itself. And we need to be able to balance respect for those places with a real opportunity that we have at this moment to seize upon the energy and momentum behind the building of a museum to interpret the history of African Americans in the city of Richmond through slavery into freedom.
I think we have to start with the premise that this is an area where people really suffered and families were torn apart. And in the sense that we honor places where that kind of psychic damage was done, battlefields, I think we have to be really, really careful how we treat an area like that. It's also an area that really has a complete catalog of the history of our city. From its earliest days, we have 18th century buildings. We have antebellum factories. We have every layer of the city's history, its first market, all in this area. And I think just as a principle of this kind of historic preservation, we need to be really sensitive to the architecture there and to not build something that's totally out of scale with what's the rest of what's in the bottom. And I think finally, there's a real need to do archaeology. We honestly don't know what necessarily is below the ground because this area has been built over so many times. And I think we need to find that out.
We are just discovering what's happened here. What happened 200 years ago, what happened 100 years ago, and even the history of this area during the 20th century. This is the epicenter of that slave trade. It is the epicenter of understanding the story of the different peoples of Shockoe Bottom and therefore of Richmond and therefore of the country. It is where the elephant in the room gets to actually become visible. And we get to talk about race, and we get to talk about economics, and we get to talk about what is here. If we can use that as the framework for development in terms of using history as a guideline for what does get developed down here, I think that we will reach more people as well as begin to be able to address some of the chronic problems that we have in the United States and in the city of Richmond. One reflects the other. And Shockoe Bottom is a unique site of amazing cultural, economic, and social histories that will allow us to have those conversations and be a draw to people around the world.